Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, obviously we had what I think you would consider day 2 of DC FanDome. And just, obviously I went around and saw some of the panels. Obviously I didn't watch everything. I'm mainly stuck to like the TV shows, but I watched some stuff here and there. But I just wanted to take the time, talk a little bit about some of the panels I saw and just kind of like some of the discussions that went down about, the future plans of some of these shows going forward into their next seasons and stuff like that. If you're curious, you can look in the description down below. I'll include time codes where I talk about the some of the panels I saw, just that way you can skip around so you can hear my thoughts about whatever it is that kind of interests you the most. So first up on the list will be Batwoman. I thought it was kind of neat. We finally get introduced to our new Batwoman, Javicia Leslie, who's playing the actress Javicia Leslie, who is playing Ryan Wilder, who is going to be our new Batwoman. And I thought it was kind of an interesting conversation they had, just about obviously what this represents, because obviously this is like the first black Batwoman in existence, so how monumentous that is and just what that means. Obviously Javicia being very grateful for the opportunity and what that can mean for the world, especially with everything going on right now. And I thought it was really interesting their perspective on this whole situation compared to where because Kate, having come from kind of, a wealthy family and everything, and the comparisons, because we are getting Ryan, who is more kind of from the streets, and that side of Gotham is her community. And for her, and I think it's such an interesting thing that first and foremost as Batwoman is wanting to, when she gets that opportunity, is, oh, I'm going to protect this community of mine. And she even made comparisons to the patients that Mary has. It's like they fall in that category. The justice system of Gotham has failed these people, and these are the people who aren't looked after, because obviously there's that, once again, and it's always the beautiful thing about Gotham, and I think it reigns so true amongst any DC city, because Gotham is the one that you always dive into, whether it's like the corruption or the social status of it all, but it obviously playing into it with the the failed justice system, in a sense of who's looking out for these people, who's going to do right by them, and her wanting to take care of them first and foremost. But I thought it was interesting because they talked about the fact that she also has to struggle a little bit with the fact of oh, I'm not just Batwoman for this community. I'm Batwoman for this entire city. This entire city is under my protection. So a little bit of that struggle of kind of your own personal, I got to look after this community, because this community that's not really represented, but in the justice system or whatever, they need me more than anyone else. But then also realizing oh, there's a greater city out here that also need. So I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic to kind of deal with, because obviously I just thought that creates this very interesting dynamic for the character. And I'm sure because I think even Kate struggled with obviously what being Batwoman meant for her. It was mainly just, oh, I want to save Sophie. Then it was about stopping Alice, and then coming to terms with the fact of the matter is what this means, this symbol of hope for this city. And I think that's going to be an interesting lane for Ryan, because it's going to be Ryan is representing oh, this community that's not represented, and it's but also got to figure. The fact is that I am hope for not just them, I'm hope for this entire city, and I think that's going to be a beautiful aspect to play with. I also thought was kind of dope is obviously they talked a little bit about Luke, how Luke already had a hard enough time wanting to give the bat suit over to Kate. And it's oh, Kate at the very least was Bruce's cousin, so there's at least a little leeway with that. He still kind of gave her a hard time, because it's we've worked with Batman so long, it's just kind of you don't see anyone else, because he always made comparisons and contrasts to oh, Bruce and everything, but obviously Kate made it her own. Now it's a thing of not only does Luke already have this thing about no, Kate, she's going no, I'm because obviously that's going to be a big part of this season of what happened to Kate, no one knows, and that mystery, and they talked about it, everyone having their own reactions and feelings about the fact is that Kate's gone. And so in Luke's case, it's giving this over to someone who maybe in his mind is oh, this person doesn't deserve it. He already felt like that towards Kate. It took a long time for him to open up, and now that part of that connection for him is gone, because they actually talked about it, because obviously for Luke, it's Kate's his connection to so much. Kate was his connection to Alice, to Sophie, to Mary, so outside of that, those bonds he created were through Kate, so it's that through line isn't there anymore. And so the fact of the matter is, this person you don't really know who, because probably in his mind it's you're from this side of Gotham or whatever, so it's probably a thing of you know, she's a little probably, you know, they say it like she's very goofy, she's very not following the rules type of person. So that contrast between them will probably lead to them butting heads a lot, much like between Kate and, you know, Luke, because it'll probably be a thing of, well, you weren't Kate. You know, it's like I made exceptions. Kate was exceptional in her own right, and I think Ryan kind of has a little bit of a steep uphill, because I'm sure for her it's probably going to be a thing of like, I don't care what you think of me, I'm doing what I want to. So I'm also, you know, obviously, you know, they didn't talk about it too much, but I'm also curious, like, what are the circumstances that are going to lead Ryan to becoming Batwoman, you know, in the grand scheme of things. It's also interesting too, because they talked about the fact that Mary, you know, without Kate being that buffer, there's still a lot of hate between her and Alice, and it's like Kate was the buffer for that, so like that rage is just going to be there. So it's like without Kate there to kind of act as that buffer, what does that mean for them? And Javicia had even talked about, like, obviously, like, because a question had asked, like, well, you know, what's her situation going to be like with the Kane family? It's like, for her, she's not really going to have much of a relation, at least at first, because obviously we know where Jacob stands. He hates vigilantes, so obviously that's going to be, you know, a complicated thing in its own right. But it's going to be interesting to see, like, how this Kate mystery, you know, about what happened to Kate, as well as this new Batwoman, what it kind of means for everyone as we get introduced to this character. They talked a little bit about it, like at the time of recording this, like Javicia hadn't had an opportunity for any costume fittings, but obviously it's really interesting because they talked about, like, obviously she's going to kind of make this suit kind of represent her. And I think that's pretty dope, because obviously it's like, you know, it's very much like Kate. Kate, you know, the Batsuit was originally Bruce, so it had to be modified over and over again so that she could represent herself, you know, from the beginning. Because they even talked about, obviously, like a storyline in the season 1 was the whole aspect about Kate having to hide away part of herself, because it's like, she already, you know, she was always open as who she is, and then the struggle of, like, being Batwoman. And obviously she ended up getting Kara to kind of, you know, do her story of, like, I'm Batwoman and I'm gay, you know. And I think that's such an interesting thing. Like, they were making comparisons of, like, you know, what's going to be, you know, Ryan's situation, because Ryan might be, like, a lot more open just as who she is as Batwoman and as who she is as Ryan, you know. So I think that's going to be such an interesting element. So, like, all that kind of, you know, obviously, like, you know, no trailers or anything like that, because I doubt there's anything. They obviously haven't had any opportunity to film anything. But I'm so curious to kind of get introduced to this and see what this all turns out to be. One interesting thing I also wanted to talk about, and I thought was kind of fascinating, they talked about the fact is initially they couldn't use Batman, which I thought was kind of interesting, because that's something that's come up from time to time too. It's like the fact is Batman's in that weird situation where, like, they kind of get weird about using him on TV. Like, obviously Gotham made an exception, but it's like, he's still Bruce Wayne 99% of the show. He's not Batman until the final episode, and you don't even get to see him fully until, like, the last shots of the episode. It's kind of similar to Smallville, but I guess you made the argument he's Superman all the time, but obviously he's mainly just Clark Kent figuring himself out as Kal-El, and then eventually at the end he becomes Superman. Regardless, it's just interesting. And now, like, we're able to bring in the fold of, like, hey, we have Hush disguising himself as Bruce Wayne, and where that storyline leads, you know, in the future with all these, you know, it's just a lot of stuff that I'm curious in the long run to see where everything kind of, you know, goes. Next up, I'm going to talk about The Flash really quickly. I think some stuff had came out with the previous DC FanDome. I could be mistaken, because I think I did come across, like, a teaser trailer. I just didn't talk about it at the time. So if you haven't seen that, I'll include a link to it in the description down below. But it's more of a sizzle reel. What was actually kind of interesting is it's actually stuff from episode 20, because, like, before production got shut down, they were actually like 85% through. So everything from that sizzle reel is 100% from the first episode. So it gives us a little insight of where we're going to be starting out next season. Obviously, like, season 7 was always going to be built off the back of obviously what happens at the end of season 6. We're just going to be kind of starting a little more where season 6 was going in this situation. But I thought that was kind of an interesting aspect, because that obviously leads us a little open and being like, okay, so what does this mean for the season? Looking at the trailer and obviously hearing some of the conversations, obviously it's like Barry, obviously he's down to, like, at one point during the trailer, and since this is just from the first episode, we're starting off with the fact is he's literally down to hours worth of speed left as his speed's draining. Try him, Chester, and everyone working to get this artificial speed force made. Obviously he has to deal with Eva, the new Mirror Master, and her just being able to pop all over the place, and like what is it that she wants at the end of the day. She got her revenge, she took down her husband, but at the end of the day it's like, what does she truly want, kind of diving into her goals, because she finally won and kind of got everything that she wanted in the end. There's the whole Iris situation. Iris being in the mirror world, and we're seeing the toll that it's taking on her. Like, she's losing her mind more and more. Probably, you could, I mean, a literal representation of her losing herself in it all. I thought was kind of fascinating as well. Obviously, she's seeing like this mirror version of her because it's messing with her mind. And the whole conversation too is, what is Iris going to be like coming out of the mirrorverse? Like, is she going to be the same person? Most likely not. Like, we don't know the long-lasting effects of just what that world does to you, because obviously it's hitting her way more than it is Camilla, or at least or what we're aware of, because she's the one who's been there the longest and her brain is trying to understand everything. So Camilla hasn't quite gotten to that point because Iris is pushing herself to try and find a way out. And I thought it was interesting too that Candace Patton ended up talking about this, how she talked about the fact is that even though Mirror Iris, which is Mirror Iris, it's like she still spoke some truths that, Iris West herself felt. And I thought that was such an interesting thing of like, okay, so, even though that was Mirror Iris talking, but that was still kind of her being a little more bold, probably saying some of the stuff that, hey, these are feelings that Iris had about, like, I don't want to be your damsel in distress. Like, I am a reporter. Let me do what I do. I don't need you to protect me. I can do things in my own right. Don't underestimate me, And so probably keeping a lot of that in mind, because despite how things played out, like, there was still this moment between Barry and Mirror Iris, because Mirror Iris or not, this was Iris regardless, And so when Iris does come back, like, I'm sure a lot of that will come up. Because another thing they brought up was the whole Star Citizen thing, because let's not forget, Allegra's the only member of Team Citizen that's still around, because obviously Camilla and Iris are in the Mirrorverse, and it's like, what's that really kind of mean for the Citizen in all this time that they've been gone, when they do come back, things, what that kind of means. And I also thought was kind of an interesting conversation was about the whole Joe and Barry situation. Obviously, they work for CCPD, and obviously with everything that's going on in the world, they were like, the whole thought process was kind of like, also like, what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? Like, how will the real world affect what they do? And the showrunner, Eric Wallace, had talked about the fact that he was like, it's going to affect Joe, but in a positive way. Because it's like, not only, yes, it can be a superhero world, but we also have to be a little more conscious of what is happening in the world and kind of be a representation of that. So obviously what's going on is going to have an effect on Joe. I'm sure, not only as, God, what is his position? He's the chief, captain, the captain, I believe, and not only that, but also being a black officer, and with everything that's going on, I'm sure that is going to have an effect on, him, and even Barry, even though Barry's not necessarily a cop, but I'm sure, like, as the Flash too, being a hero and everything. So I'm curious to see kind of where that direction for their story goes. There's also something that I feel so stupid for never realizing. It's like, someone had brought up, it's like, oh, when will Barry get the gold boots? I'm like, gold boots? I was like, you're right. The Flash has gold boots. I don't know why I'm such an idiot and never realized that. Because I could be mistaken. Didn't John Wesley Shipp's Barry have the gold boots from the Earth 90s? Flash had the gold boots. I could be mistaken, but it just never crossed my mind. I guess because, like, obviously this has been my de facto Flash for so long that it's like I didn't even think about that, because I haven't seen an animated Flash in so long, which is also idiotic to say, because the last time I saw an animated Flash was like a couple years ago when I saw the Flash Paradox movie, but I guess it just never clicked in my head. Oh yeah, the golden boots. It's kind of like, oh, we gotta eventually get up to that and stuff like that, which I thought was so interesting. I was like, that's such a specific tie to the character that I was like, oh, I'm sure there's other people screaming the entire time, where's the gold boots? It never crossed my mind because I'm an idiot. It never correlated in my head. Yeah, I'm excited to see kind of where all these new stories take us next season. What's next? Frost. What's next for Cisco as he comes back from Atlantis? Even them talking about, like, what his adventures at Atlantis was kind of like, potentially, so I thought that was all dope stuff. Next up, I wanted to talk about Pennyworth. They actually brought up some really interesting stuff during this. Like, one of the big things they talked about was Martha's character, and I thought it was interesting, once again, as someone who's not well versed in the comic books, I didn't know how much of the show was just kind of Martha being Martha for this show, and how much was kind of pulled from the comic books. It turns out a lot of this is pulled from just making Martha who she is in the show. So, because that's what I was thinking, like, everything with her and the No Name link, I was like, oh, that was so interesting that we've never really known that about Martha. And it turns out, well, the reason why is because obviously that's something they made specifically for the show, because obviously in the comic book, she's always just kind of sadly just allocated to just simply being, oh, Batman's mom. Like, obviously there's bits and pieces here and there that they talk about. Like, obviously the comic books apparently have kind of gone over, but even then it's just not a lot. This is their opportunity to kind of run a little rampant and kind of do what they want to with her. Not rampant wouldn't be the right word. But then kind of run free is kind of what I mean, to kind of do what they want to with the character and kind of make her be something more. And, you know, and I thought that was such a interesting avenue to it, because obviously, you know, something I didn't really know about, and I had to want to kind of talk about this, and it's kind of, you know, floats a little more in the Batwoman side of things, but obviously it's like the Kane side of the family, which, you know, it's Martha's side of the family. Like, apparently someone had told me, like, I mean, maybe this also varies from different comic book iterations, but obviously the Waynes and the Kanes, actually there's bad blood there, because that's always something I was always interested in too, because I was like, obviously, like, you know, it never really came up in Gotham. It was like, why no one from the Kane side of the family ever came to Bruce. Like, after his mom and dad died, that was kind of the only real family he had. But obviously they're being kind of bad blooded. I'm curious, is that something that's ever going to be tackled in this? And that was something I was curious about going into season 1, whether there's going to be any of that. Maybe not, probably not. Because obviously more so than anything, when you bring up like the Wayne's family, it's more so about Thomas, because obviously that's his family, that's his legacy that, you know, Bruce is carrying on as a Wayne and everything. And obviously Martha kind of gets drafted along with all of that, but, you know, just them kind of giving her in her own right kind of being who she is in the show, kind of having an opportunity to be this character with this interesting story. Like I said, being associated with the No Name League, kind of mixed up with the CIA and everything because of everything with Thomas. I mean, him being part of the CIA and everything like that's pretty interesting. What I thought was also interesting too is that they said that they make, because they talked about it seems like it's been at least like there's going to be a time skip in between season 1 and season 2, like a year or so, because obviously, you know, it varies from show to show, because some shows will make it a good chunk of time has passed, or maybe they'll make it so that it kind of picks up relatively soon after the previous season or whatever. But obviously, like, they brought up the fact is that Thomas went back to the U.S. to recover from his gunshot wound, but also when he, you know, he's worked his way up the CIA ladder, and when he comes back, what that means for him and Martha, because, you know, Martha's been caught up in this, you know, civil war situation that's going down in London the entire time, and that how both of them have, you know, changed, you know, from who they were, because obviously they had their, you know, they were at each other's throats a lot of times, and they're at odds and ends with each other in season 1, and probably even more so than that, because they probably come back a little bit different. Their experiences and what they've done and what they've been through has changed them, you know, what full scope we'll have to, you know, wait for the next season to see. But a big part of this too is also, you know, what about Alfred? Alfred's changed. You know, you even talked about the fact of the matter is he's a little more hard and clinical because of everything. I mean, it's like Esme, your dad, like that's enough to change anyone. And, you know, so the whole conversation also becomes a thing of, you know, he wants to leave London because it's just kind of like, after everything that's going on, of course you want to escape, like, all the terrible stuff that's going down. Someone had brought up the fact is, the matter is, like, yeah, shoot your own dad, like, you know, stop him from doing all the terrible stuff. And so all, you know, and obviously the way things still played out regardless of it all. And then on top of all of that, you have, you know, him wanting to potentially escape to America, so you can kind of that American dream type of thing. But at the same time, it's like he has so many ties and connections to London. He has family, he has friends in London. It's his past, he's rooted in London. So that struggle of wanting to leave, but can you leave? You know, what would eventually make him leave to become, you know, the butler that, you know, we kind of come to know that he eventually becomes. And I thought that was such an interesting discussion point about Alfred's character in that regard. Bruno Heller ended up talking a little bit more about, like, obviously what to kind of expect a little bit from the next season, that there will be more Batman related stuff. It's going to be stuff where he's like, if you're in the know, so if you're more well versed in the comic books, or you're at least well versed in the whole Batman thing, you're going to be like, okay, oh, here's some Batman stuff, so if you get it, you get it, you don't, you don't. But they are going to be introducing other Batman stuff. Like, one big character name they dropped was Lucius Fox, and I'm like, okay, so that's going to be interesting to see the context of, like, you know, Lucius's part to play in the story, you know, I mean, who he is, where we are, and what stage of his life we're in, because obviously we're dealing with, like, younger versions of everyone, Martha, Thomas, and Alfred. Next up, I want to talk about Lucifer. There wasn't a lot in this panel. They just mainly talked about the fact is an upcoming musical episode, which is pretty dope, which obviously I've gained an appreciation over musicals over the past couple years, especially like shows integrating like musical episodes. Obviously, one of my favorites being the TV show The Magicians. They would do, like, ever since season 2, they've been doing like at least like one musical every season. So for Lucifer to have one would be pretty dope, because the showrunners, they had talked about the fact is it's something that's kind of been floated around for a while, but now it's finally an opportunity that they had, and just like obviously the time and the hard work and coordination needed to make this thing happen was pretty dope. So we got a little snippet of it, because obviously the show, the co-showrunners were both talking with the director of this episode. I think he'd actually directed stuff in the past when it came to Lucifer as well, but it was really interesting getting that snippet of it, because it is a thing of like, at first, Lucifer's the only, because it's interesting because it's a musical, but it's like Lucifer's the only one recognizing, like, he's like, what the hell is going on? And they're busting into a number, and then we go back to the crime scene, he's like, wait, what just happened? So he's the only one conscious and aware, you know, that like, what the hell is this musical? And like, obviously they've had little musical numbers in the past, but it was just in the context of the story, like, there's one in season 4, just a little like dance moment that they just kind of don't acknowledge. So I don't know if it's kind of playing into that, but they did kind of hint that like there's reasonings why this musical thing is happening, probably also why Lucifer's the only one. So it makes you think like, oh, it's got to be like a celestial thing potentially. So what's also dope too is obviously we got like a blooper reel. I mean, if you are curious, I'll include a link to it in the description down below, but it's a blooper reel for season 4. Obviously, they talked a little bit about the fact of the matter is they went into season 5 thinking it was going to be the end. So obviously, it was interesting when they actually got to know it's like, hey, you can do a 6th season. And for them, and I thought it was interesting, the showrunners were saying like, they were actually given a choice, which I think is actually pretty dope. They were like, no, we're pretty okay with, you know, where we've crafted the story to end. But then they were like, you know what? We actually do have one more story in it. So I thought that was pretty dope. Once again, I'm always happy for a show to end because the creators want to. They're like, oh, do I have a story to tell? It's like, no, we have one more story to tell. Which is going to be interesting because if they crafted season 5 to kind of be the end, obviously things must be open-ended enough for it to be a thing of like it to be a proper ending, also having some stuff left open, or not unless they're going back and retroactively changing a little bit of season 5 to be like, oh, leave, you know, or maybe... I don't know. I'm curious to see kind of what that means. Obviously, we still have the second half of season 5. Obviously, like they had to shut down production. I'm not sure where they were in production-wise when it came to everything. I'm assuming just because they showed us this episode and they were talking about we're excited, you know, for people to see the musical episode, that it's one of the episodes they did before productions were shut down. So, still, I'm very excited to see, you know, what the second half of season 5 looks like, what goes down storyline wise, but also curious to see what this one last story they have crafted for the, you know, the 6th and final season and everything. So I think that's all, you know, pretty dope information. Next up, I'm going to talk about DC's Legends of Tomorrow. Obviously, we got a little more insight into, you know, what we can kind of expect from the next season. What was really dope is one of the big things they ended up talking about was Behrad and Zari's relationship, because that's something we've never really had an opportunity to really kind of dive into, because Zari, you know, Zari 1.0, you know, because they differentiate between 1.0 and 2.0, which is interesting because they even talked about the fact that during the panel that they had contemplated like whether or not they were going to keep 1.0 and 2.0 around. That's what I thought they were going to do. So for them to get rid of 1.0 like that actually took me by surprise too. And even the actress who plays Zari saying like, you know, how she felt a little conflicted by it. She had mixed feelings about it, just because obviously this is a character, you know, you've crafted and everything, and for that character to be going completely now, I mean, granted, she's in the totem, but it's never going to be quite the same. So this 2.0 Zari is kind of who we're going to be with for now, and just seeing, you know, where her story goes and how she evolves and everything. So I like that even she has mixed feelings about it, you know, in a good way, obviously. But circling back to it, like, you know, Zari 1.0 never really talked about Behrad that much, you know, to my recollection, just because it's like, well, her brother wasn't around anymore. She felt her own guilt about it and everything. So, you know, there wasn't much there. And obviously, there's also the whole conversation about like, oh yeah, like, Behrad has to pretend like he's been around the entire time. Like, it's like, oh yeah, like you have to create this dynamic with the team, like you've been here with them through 3 other previous seasons when in fact you hadn't, you know? So that was kind of an interesting struggle, but it's like this next season will give us an opportunity to really get to dive into the relationship. Behrad, sorry, being the young sibling that's always in his sister's shadow. She's the older sibling that's always the successful one, and he's just, you know, him, you know? And so they had referenced there's going to be specifically an episode that kind of really dives into that. So I think that's going to be a neat aspect to this whole situation. Another thing is the whole Constantine and Astra thing, you know, and I thought it was kind of interesting them talking about the fact of the matter is Constantine's stories almost come full circle and ended, because obviously, you know, even from the show Constantine and obviously even the comic books, Astra has always been a focal point of his story. So for that whole situation to be resolved and for John to be happy is kind of interesting. But once again, John is never happy for long, so that's the whole conversation of like, you know, maybe John's going to be unhappy with being happy. It's like, you know, it doesn't sit right with him. It's something he's not used to. And obviously, like, potentially him and Astra living together and just them bumping heads, potentially, like, what that dynamic is like, especially because, like, obviously, like, he already held so much guilt over, you know, the whole Astra situation, and Astra has hated him for so long as well, you know, because blaming him for her circumstances and everything. So it's like a lot of that healing probably, you know, was dealt with in season 5, but I'm sure in season 6 you're going to dive into that more, especially if they're living together, him looking after her and everything. I thought was kind of a, you know, a pretty dope aspect to kind of really, you know, think about, you know. One key thing they made sure to kind of note too is the whole alien situation. I'm such an idiot because it didn't correlate in my head that that was Sarah getting abducted by aliens at the end of season 5. I just felt like, oh, that's some weird crazy thing. It never I guess it just, because the show is so weird and crazy, it didn't cross my mind to think like, oh, we're going to jump to aliens. I mean, it makes sense. Aliens exist in this continuity. We already knew that even before Crisis, because we knew the whole situation of, because of, you know, the Dominators, because of the heroes versus aliens. So obviously that was already in existence, even more so now that all the Earths have collapsed into one. All the remaining other Earths have collapsed into this one on Earth Prime. So them kind of diving into that, why Sarah out of anyone was abducted. And they even talked about the fact of the matter is we are going to dive into that, you know, Sarah's adventures with this whole, like, you know, being abducted situation. Even talking about like what the team's going to be like now, like, oh, like basically mom's away, so the kids will play and everyone's just kind of like being a little out of order and just kind of being all over the place. But even Ava, even as co-captain, like obviously she has to balance dealing with her feelings of like Sarah's missing and what that kind of does for her, so she's not going to be 100% in the right mind state to lead the team, because obviously she's the more kind of like, she's the one that's kind of meant to be like the clear vision and focus. But even that kind of gets a little wonky when it comes to the Legends, because the Legends have a tendency to just kind of shake stuff up to the point that your clear, concise vision isn't always going to work out. You know, it's just Ava's, you know, who she is personality wise. It's just like literally polar opposite with the Legends, yet at the same time gel so well in its own weird way. Obviously that's the whole conversation, like, well, you know, the show has just gotten weirder and better just as the show is going on, and just like how wacky and wild it is, and just you throw in aliens on top of that. They made a point to say, like, you know, Supergirl has its own vision of how they handle aliens, how they represent aliens. We're gonna, you know, put our own little stamp to it. So I thought that was such an interesting aspect to it. And then he also talked about the fact of the matter is we are getting a new Legend this season, and I was immediately in my brain, I was thinking it was going to be Ryan. I could be misremembering his name, but it's the character who was the paragon of humanity in the Crisis situation. Because a little spoilerish, that character, because I didn't know this until other people pointed it out, that character is the next Adam in the comic books. So that's why I was immediately thinking, like, you know, with Ray going, that he was going to step. I mean, granted, that's something they could always pick from later on. But this particular character, they're saying this is a Latinx character who has a connection to the aliens, that they were abducted as well. But this character is joining the Legends. They're filled with revenge, and it's like we're having a character kind of similar to how Ava was kind of very polar opposite to the Legends, and yet there was something there. This is going to be a character who's joining with the Legends, who is like, what's up with this band of losers? Like, they're all this group of losers, and it's like this person's like, no, I'm not here to play, I'm here to do my thing. So it's like, you know, having someone who's going to be a part of this team that doesn't gel well. I mean, and to be fair, they talked about that, like, oh, being a part of this team, you kind of have to go through your trials and tribulations, that obviously you got to earn your spot. So obviously we've seen that with a lot of characters over the course of the show, you know, whether it be Azari, whether it be an Astra, like having to find their way and their path in this team, you know, coming from the outside, being kind of a different person and changing more. So, because like every character that's been a part of the Legends has changed from who they were. You know, obviously you see that more so than anything through Sarah's character, like as she's developed, how she's changed, how everyone that's a part of this crew has changed. They also included a blooper reel from last season as well. So just a lot of really interesting stuff and discussions, so I'm excited to see kind of what season 6 has in store for us with Legends. Then let's go to Titans. We obviously get a little bit of a recap, some favorite moments from last season, but also some conversations about where things could potentially go in season 3. Obviously one big thing they talked about was Hank and Dawn's relationship, but more so also Hawk and Dove, because it's like Hank and Dawn are putting their relationship to an end, but what about Hawk and Dove? And what that partnership is like without that relationship aspect to it, and can it work and stuff like that. It's like we posed that question at the end of season 2, and it's like they brought up the fact that you're immediately going to get the answer to that in season 3. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see. Can they separate it? Like obviously their issues, the reason why they didn't work as a couple, can they still work together with that history that they have? While also not being in a relationship, like what that dynamic is going to be like. It's going to be an interesting avenue to go down. And talking about relationships, there's also the Blackfire and Starfire situation. Obviously them being two very different people, and obviously Starfire being Blackfire being a big part of this season, and just like what that means, because they had talked about basically having an opportunity to kind of get like a microscope look at their relationship, because the question that posed itself is like whether you have an opportunity to kind of see where their issues stem from, like when they were younger. Let's say maybe you get some of that insight through moments they have together present day, or whether you actually, I wasn't really quite sure how they were phrasing it, whether or not you would actually get those look backs like in a flashback type of situation, maybe not, or whether it just be from the perspective of seeing them present day and dredging up those issues, whatever the case may be. I think that's going to be interesting. Another lane I thought was kind of dope is like the whole aspect of Donna and Rachel, because obviously, Rachel's powers are growing and everything, and obviously finding out what those new dynamics mean for her, kind of her being away from the Titans herself this season, while also trying to bring Donna back. And because obviously at the end of season 2, we find out the Bruce they met ended up not being not being the real Bruce. That was something that Rachel had concocted just to kind of bring everybody back together. Like obviously that's a conversation between Dawn and Corey about that. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect to that whole situation. But along with all that, it's like what their story is going to, Donna and Rachel's story is going to be. It's like obviously dealing with potentially the underworld, and obviously what that means, kind of like that transition in into the afterlife, potentially what that looks like in this universe. And obviously the question had come up, the moderator had asked, like, does the way Donna died have something to do with how she's going to get resurrected? And they say yes. Obviously they don't go too much into it, because the whole conversation is, we all know that DC loves the Lazarus Pit, and even like the actress who plays Rachel/Raven was kind of like, oh yeah, they do love the Lazarus Pit. Doesn't seem like that's the route they're going down. But then the point that they made, like, oh, because obviously she got electrocuted. So me and my brain was like, is this going to have something to do with Zeus? Because we know that Zeus, once again, this is just based on the movie Wonder Woman, that we know Zeus is her dad. So I don't know if that's something where, like, in Wonder Woman's, in Diana's case, like, that's true all across every continuity, or at least most continuity. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Like, part of me was wondering, is it going to have some correlation in that regard? Or the fact is the electricity itself might have something specifically tied to Themyscira that maybe I'm not aware of. In either fashion, I thought that was kind of interesting. But that specific question of like, oh, her specifically dying the way she does that have anything to do with how she's going to be resurrected? And it's like, yeah, so I thought that was kind of an interesting little insight. What's also interesting, and this is something I heard a little bit before the panel, I saw the panel and everything. It was actually a little while back. I don't remember where I heard the news from, but they were saying that there was going to be a Red Hood this season, that Jason Todd would become Red Hood, which I think is interesting because, once again, someone who is not well versed in comic books and stuff like that, for me, the circumstances under which Jason Todd became, Red Hood was after his death and everything, after being beaten to death by the Joker and everything from the comic books, because I think for him, he felt like so angry, lost, and forgotten, and that led to him becoming who he is as Red Hood, because obviously it's a character I'm not familiar with at all, so an opportunity to see that character in Titans, to get an opportunity to learn more about the character in that regard is pretty dope. But I think the circumstances might be different, but I think a lot of that is still there, because I think for Jason, it's just like after everything he went through, just kind of was falling out with just the Titans, as well as with Bruce and everything, just kind of being tired of it. Like, obviously, like, there's a lot of underlining issues for Jason that were never really fully dealt with last season. And just also, you know, because obviously, like, they talked about it, that mentorship, that brothership between Dick and Jason. Because obviously, for Dick, he's trying to, like, his failed mentorship from Bruce, he tries to, you know, correct that by being a great mentor for Jason. But obviously, we see that in season 1 and season 2 does not work out the way he thinks it does. I mean, obviously, even when he's more vulnerable, obviously telling the team the truth about the whole history, the real history between him and Slade, the one that he's kind of hidden from, not just the new Titans, but even like OG Titans and everything, that being the whole thing. But what I thought was fascinating about that whole thing is, like, you know, the fact is with him, you know, and the Rose situation playing out the way it did the last season, what that means for him, you know, I think he does, you know, they show it, like, obviously it's like at the end of the season he drove off, like, I think him alone, feeling alone and angry. I think so, like, a lot of those circumstances, the circumstances are different why he becomes Red Hood, but I think a little bit of those emotions and some of that feeling from why he became Red Hood, maybe in the comic books and other storylines, is still there. So I think that's going to be interesting, kind of, you know, diving into that. Also, some new interesting information we were getting was the fact of the matter is this next season is going to be them in Gotham, which I think is going to be pretty dope, seeing, you know, all this Gotham related stuff that's happening all over the place when it comes to DC stuff, but also kind of, you know, what that means for them, because obviously it made the whole conversation about beating themselves up and, you know, over their past sins has kind of been something that they've kind of dealt with, and that is actually going to take most of the season for something that Donna says to finally resonate with them, because the whole thing is, like, they spent so much time story-wise pulling them apart that, you know, this season is about them struggling to do everything to stay together. So I think that's going to be an interesting situation and dynamic. Obviously, they threw in the whole, you know, Jonathan Crane situation, so I'm sure, like, you know, Scarecrow can definitely play into a story of that, giving into your, like, obviously these people who, all these characters who do beat themselves up over, you know, their past and everything, and adding in a character like Crane, the fear gas and everything, you know, because it also depends on, like, where he is in his career. Is he fully established? Could this be like could this be the birth of Scarecrow, and what that means in the grand scheme of things? It's going to be an interesting aspect. And, you know, obviously, you know, maybe we get to see other, you know, DC characters as well. One other character they mentioned was Commissioner Barbara Gordon. Now that says a lot, because now it makes you wonder, okay, because now we're getting into the nitty gritty of this continuity, like, okay, so what's happened, what hasn't happened? So the fact that she's commissioner now, does that mean that Gordon has a higher position? Does that mean that he's passed away? Like, the fact of the matter is Barbara I mean, and it's so interesting too, and I think that speaks volumes that both Barbara and Dick moved into police work after their whole situation. Him being a detective, her being commissioner and everything. I think that speaks volumes that they moved away from their crime fighting days to still crime fight, just in a more legal sense. Obviously, we've seen, like, obviously how Dick has handled that. So the question becomes, like, you know, how has Barbara handled it? You know, what we might get some final insight into what her relationship was like with Bruce, and also, like, what her relationship was like with Dick. Like, you know, the fact of the matter is they, you know, they made a comparison of, like, obviously, like, there's the whole situation of, like, failed fathers, you know, them trying to make up for the, you know, the past of their father. So, like, you know, in the sense that, like, Bruce and Gordon had their relationship. I mean, more so Batman and Gordon had their relationship, and this is supposed to be their exact words, or this is supposed to be, like, the second generation of that. And, you know, both of them making up for their failed fathers. Dick making up for, you know, Bruce, and obviously for Barbara and her dad. So, like, maybe it's a situation of they, you know, in this continuity, maybe they, obviously they weren't the best father figures. I mean, in particular case of Gordon, you know. So that's going to be an interesting situation. Because also, once again, it's like, so what has their story been like? Obviously, she was Batgirl, but when it comes to being Batgirl, you know, we don't know, we'd assume. But her being Batgirl, what does that mean? You know, has there ever been another Batgirl after her or not? Also, what about the whole Oracle thing? Has that already happened to her in the storyline, or has it happened? Has it not happened? Because obviously Jason's story doesn't play out like it typically does in the comic books, you know, how his story plays out with Joker. So who's to say the same thing doesn't happen in Barbara's case, that she didn't, like, her situation didn't play out the same, or maybe it did. That's just going to be an interesting dynamic, you know, seeing, you know, Nightwing and everything, you know, back in the city along with the Titans doing things in Gotham, and just, you know, this being, you know, how active is Bruce as Batman, you know, that, you know, now that Jason isn't around as much as Robin, or maybe he was still doing stuff. There's so much to kind of fill in there that I'm so curious to kind of see what that means for everything in the grand scheme of things. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is the obviously upcoming Superman and Lois show. And obviously, you know, I kind of already went into this kind of having my thoughts about, you know, what to kind of expect from the show just a little bit we heard previously, but obviously we kind of get a little more insight into the show, kind of what sets it apart from any other Superman show in certain regards, or any Superman story in general, because there's a whole conversation about the fact is that this is Superman and Lois who are already married. You know, this is already through like the, oh, does she know, doesn't she know, like it's well past that. They've been together for a while, and obviously this is them as parents. And now obviously to me, I always thought that was such an interesting aspect to this show, is going to be them balancing being parents to this whole, you know, while also, you know, doing their thing about, like, you know, how do you balance being like the world's champion and hero and the world's like most renowned and greatest like reporter? Like, how do you balance all of that while also, you know, being parents and everything on top of all of that, you know? What's interesting too is because obviously we know because of Crisis their situation changed. Initially they only had one son, and now it's like, oh, we have boys. I mean, which is even interesting because obviously, you know, on in what was it, 167, or you know, where Smallville took place, we know that they had two girls. So once again, it's just always interesting how things kind of end up playing. I mean, it's very much like the whole John and Sarah situation in Arrow. You know, obviously because of Flashpoint, but also like obviously because Oliver made some changes during Crisis. So there's that whole situation. But then on top of that, I thought was kind of interesting is because of Crisis, it allowed them to do something even more interesting, but not only giving them two boys, two teenage boys, twins in particular. And it's like, because at first I heard that, because even because Jim Lee was moderating it, he was like, what? Like, how you guys are too young to have, you know, teenagers. But at the same time, it's like, you know, it's they play with the fact is obviously because he's a Kryptonian, he ages slower, because they made a whole point of that in season 2 of Supergirl. It's kind of like that Saiyan situation in Dragon Ball Z, like how Vegeta and Goku like age super slow comparison to everyone else. Like everyone gets older, but they end up miraculously staying exactly the same, at least appearance wise and stuff like that. So I think it's kind of in a similar vein, but it's like they have two teenage boys now, because showing that, you know, at the very least, because of this new continuity and everything, that must mean that they started having kids way sooner in this new post-Crisis world than previously. So it's not only do you have two kids to deal with, you're dealing with teenagers and just the struggles of that, you know, balancing all of that is just kind of, you know, and I think that's going to be such an interesting aspect, because it's like, yeah, we're dealing with the family situation, but you're also going to get your superhero heroics and everything, like of, you know, Superman doing the, you know, Superman thing, and Lois doing the reporter thing, her facing villains in her own right, is kind of what they were talking about. So I thought that was kind of some interesting stuff. And obviously they talked a lot about, you know, what this character means, you know, as Superman, and both Lois, what they both represent, especially in Lois's case, being a journalist in a time where it's like, obviously, you know, how people feel about the media and journalists in general, and that integrity and getting the truth out there. And that's going to be an interesting thing to kind of deal with in this, you know, in this day and age. Obviously for someone as renowned as Lois, like how she confronts something like that is going to be an interesting thing to see the show kind of, you know, talk about and comment on. And obviously what Superman represents in this time, because of what, you know, both, you know, in the real world as well as in this world, because, you know, that symbol, that the House of L emblem that he holds, you know, being hope and everything, you know, that's good. Like such an interesting, you know, aspect. And it's one of the things I'm looking forward about this show, is just seeing like how they construct this story once again, of like, obviously, you know, the whole thing before was like, okay, so what existed in this continuity beforehand? Like that was the whole thing with Supergirl, like what already existed in the super family history of like what villains were established, and obviously stuff like that. We know Lex, for example, and stuff like that. We know he's around kicking and doing his own thing, and you know what kind of effects him having on Supergirl, what that means for, you know, this continuity and stuff like that. Once again, what other villains are already established, what villains haven't been born yet in this continuity, stuff like that is always, to me, you know, very interesting to kind of find out as well. They bring up the fact is that Clark and Lois are moving back to Smallville. They don't want to spoil it, but there's like a specific thing that happens that triggers them to move to Smallville. And obviously it's like, oh, like, you know, there's a more simpler life away from like kind of the bustle of Metropolis, I think. But also what was interesting is they made note of like, you know, obviously running into other characters like Lana Lang, for example, and obviously that being Clark's first love, and obviously not necessarily creating this love triangle situation necessarily, but more so just like how Clark as an adult, as a husband, as a father, like handles like running into like, oh, this is like my first love, like running into her, and how he handles it as an adult. Like obviously they were saying like it's not gonna be like a cheating situation, but it's just gonna be that complicated nature of like how do you handle that now as an adult, because this was like someone that you fell in love with when you were a teenager, like, you know, just like what that dynamic is kind of like, and obviously like how that kind of intermingles with Clark's life in particular, him and Lois's life, and their children's life, because I think they were saying like maybe she has kids or whatever. I mean, like I said, I could have been misinterpreting it, like, but obviously, like, you know, the story about their boys and everything, because obviously the whole conversation too is like, well, they're his kids, so how much of him is passed down to his sons, and like, how much would they be struck? Because they didn't really get into that, so the question then becomes like, you know, how much of what Clark is as a Kryptonian has passed on to them or not, you know? So it's going to be an interesting avenue all in its own right. But what's also interesting too is like we're learning that he is going to get a new suit this season, so what that's going to look like, you know, what the circumstances are going to be that lead to this new suit and everything. I'm curious to kind of see what that ends up being the case, you know? Is he going to get a little more nanotechy like Kara's suit is that we got this past season in season 5 or not? I'd be so curious to see, you know, what this new design and look and feel is, you know? They'd also talked about the fact is we're bringing Lois's dad into the story, and that's going to be interesting because I'm curious, like, how much does Lois's dad know? Does, like, he know that Clark is Superman, or is that still kind of a secret that she still has the balance of, like, that type of, like, I know Clark is Superman, but no one else does, you know, struggling with that. I mean, even your kids probably struggling with it. You would assume that they know, but maybe they don't. Like I said, it comes up of whether or not they are displaying powers or not. So you'd assume that's still being a thing because because I think that'd be a hard thing to balance, even if your kids didn't know, you not being there a lot, you know, just because you're off doing your superhero thing. And obviously it's like, you already know what one parent does being this renowned reporter. You also don't know about your dad being a superhero. But I mean, even if you do, that probably adds this extra layer, just like you weren't there and everything. Because even Elizabeth Tulloch had talked about the fact of the matter is like almost like the sacrifice that comes with being, you know, with Superman. The fact of the matter is it's like having this sacrifice, knowing like what he means for the world, what the world needs him to be. And I thought that was interesting because even Tyler had talked about the fact of the matter is it is that situation of, you know, because obviously the whole conversation, how you balance it all. And it's like, well, it's like, when do you take the cape off? When is enough? When have you done enough good that you're like, okay, I can turn it off? Because that's always the thing of like, you know, is it right for you to have a life as a normal Clark Kent, you know, when there's so much in the world that you can do as Superman, like 24/7, like, so how do you know, how much is enough for you to be like, no, it's okay, I gotta be here for my family, I gotta be a father, I gotta be a husband, you know, so that whole dynamic. But circling back to what I was bringing up, the whole thing about General Lane and everything, and obviously him having his own perspective on who Superman is, seeing Superman as a soldier and a weapon, and obviously that called, like, obviously like him being the general that he is, obviously the issues that it creates for Lois, like the friction that exists between their relationship, his tactics as a father, you know, being a father and everything, and like his life as a general and everything, probably didn't lead to the whole best parent. Well, not necessarily trying to judge it, but his parenting style is going to be very different, you know, between how Lois and Clark handle the whole thing. But in particular, the comparison is just like a father raising children, like how Clark handles it versus how General Lane handled it. So I think that was kind of an interesting dynamic they made sure to kind of note as well. Just kind of hitting off some little ones here and there. Obviously Doom Patrol, obviously it was mainly just kind of a recap of kind of season 2 and season 1, just kind of talking about obviously the new additions and just kind of what this means for people's stories and stuff like that. And to me, what I thought was kind of an impactful question that ended up getting brought up, or rather conversation, was about how the show handles mental health. That yes, like, because even you think from the beginning, you would think like, oh, the only character they really dive into that would be Jane, aka Crazy Jane. But the fact of the matter is, it's shown that obviously there's mental health that they kind of help and respond and mold with other characters as well. And I thought that is kind of a beautiful aspect of that show, that, you know, you can dive into these heroes who all have their own issues, you know, and obviously just kind of what the correlation and the connections between the characters, like Dorothy and Jane, their similarities, both of them, their complicated natures of having Niles be this father figure in Jane's case, and obviously that case for Dorothy as well, and just kind of like the sisterly bond that they almost have, but also like the complications that came with it. Obviously we saw how that story ended up playing out in season 2, But not too much beyond that. Not like, you know, what we could expect next necessarily. What they would kind of, more so like where they would want, you know, character stories to potentially go and stuff like that. But kind of no really here nor there about like future aspects of the whole Doom Patrol situation. So like I said, just from what I saw, that was kind of mainly it. I don't know, maybe there's other stuff out there. One thing I thought was pretty dope was the whole DC Stargirl situation. Was it was moderated by Leah Thompson. I was like, holy shit, because I didn't realize she actually directed one of the episodes. I always got to be more mindful of that. She directed part 1 of Shiv, and I thought that was pretty dope. But also they talked a little bit, just kind of like the cast, you know, kind of us as the audience, kind of getting an opportunity to know a little bit about them. Obviously, like, you know, Jeff Johns talking a little bit about, because obviously, you know, the story means a lot to him, his character and everything means a lot to him. So they actually talked about some little things here and there about like little things in the show that are kind of things that because we end up finding out, you know, because Amy Smart had talked about the fact of the matter is the character Barbara is named after Jeff's mom. So I thought that was kind of neat. What I thought was kind of a neat little tidbit was like, because once again, not well versed in the comic books, when it comes to Stripe is always remote controlled in a comic book, so they made a choice, like it was just kind of like a thing that they just kind of tested out and ended up sticking with, was having Pat actually in Stripe, making it so that he's actually there with Courtney, so it makes things a little bit different because it's a thing of like, obviously like it's a little detached if he's just there piloting it from far away, but now it's like, oh, he's there in, you know, in the brawl with her, like it has that connection. It makes it even deeper, like, you know, he's not just sending out a robot to fight by side, he's literally there inside the robot fighting beside you. So I think that adds a dynamic to their relationship. To me, what this conversation piece that kind of stuck out to me, because obviously for Breck, the actress who plays Courtney / Stargirl, she talked about the fact is that she would love, you know, kind of diving deeper into the rivalry between Courtney, you know, Stargirl, and Cindy, aka Shiv. And she made a comparison. She said it reminds her of Kim Possible and Shigo. I was like, I lost my mind because I was like, you just dropped the Kim Possible reference. Because if you didn't know, growing up, I loved Kim Possible. This actually probably has one of my favorite finales too, just because of shit. Regardless, I just thought that was so neat. I was like, oh, look at you, that's so dope, you know? You dropping that comparison, and then when you actually break it down and think about it, it's like, there's a lot of similarities between Shigo and Kim's situation to, you know, Cindy and Courtney. So I thought that was just kind of a little dope perspective, you know? In that regard. But regardless, like, you know, it was, you know, obviously some stuff that obviously they're looking forward to doing season 2 and stuff like that. But like I said, it was mainly just kind of getting to know the cast a little bit, obviously, and everything. So that's what this was kind of mainly about. But those little things here and there I thought was actually kind of like pretty dope. So I actually also watched the villains panel, which was really interesting. Like, obviously these different people who've played villains. Because one of them was like Mark Strong. I didn't realize this, you know, because I haven't seen the movie in like forever, because it came out like 2011. I haven't seen it since it was in theaters, was Green Lantern. I didn't realize he plays Sinestro. Once again, it's been like 9 years since I've seen the movie. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because also obviously he played, because I'd actually forgotten his character's name. It's like it's Dr. Savan from Shazam. And obviously, so that was like pretty dope. And obviously it's interesting too, because obviously John Glover's there, because obviously he played Lex's dad in Smallville, but he also played Mark Strong's character, you know, Dr. Savan's dad in Shazam, which I had noted when I watched the movie Shazam, just how dope that is. I didn't also know this either. He voiced the Riddler in the animated series, because he actually talked about it, like the original voice actor for the Joker, like had to be recasted or whatever, and so Mark Hamill went over to the Joker and he played the Riddler. He was like, I was only in 3 episodes, so he was able to just kind of do his own voice and everything. I was like, oh, that's so interesting. And I love him being like, yeah, Mark, whatever. And they were like, it's hard to say whether that was a joke or not, because he talks about the fact is, I thought he was joking. He was like, yeah, Mark, yeah, what's his face? It's like, oh yeah, one of like the most known actors, because for being Luke Skywalker and the Joker, but he was also like, I'm old. Like, what do you want from me? So it's hard to say whether he was really joking or not, but whatever the case may be, it is funny for him to be like, you know, Mark, whatever his name was, you know. So whether he was joking or not, I thought that was still kind of funny, and everyone kind of got a crack out of that. But it was just obviously these conversations, because like obviously one person to be in there is freaking Clancy Brown. You do not realize how many damn voices Clancy Brown does until you look up. You're like, I didn't know he was this. I didn't know he did that. Like, it's just so crazy, because when you hear him talk, you're like, you can't help but think, like, when you realize he's Lex Luthor from, like, I mean, because he voices Lex in a lot of stuff, but obviously, like, my first instance of knowing him as Lex was from the animated series. Granted, at the time, I didn't know him as Clancy Brown, but as, you know, now I've gotten older, I've seen him in other works and stuff like that. We hear him talk, he has that's such a distinct voice. You're like, I mean, for one, that's Mr. Krabs, which that took me a long time to be like, oh my god, that's Mr. Krabs. But also, it's like, that's Lex Luthor, you know? So it's like, when you hear him talk, you hear a little bit of that Lex. So just that panel in general was kind of interesting, because you had so many people who had, like, Diedrich, who has done Lex. I think he did it for, like, Superman Red Sun, the movie and everything. And so just all these, was it Jason Isaac was talking about, or is it Jason Clark? I'm butchering his name, but he had talked about the fact of the matter is, like, I like how he spun it, where he's talking about, like, oh, these villains. He's like, I don't need to be here. We're not villains. These are just misunderstood heroes. And just obviously the thing of, like, the ego of a character who thinks, like, oh, in their own right, like, I'm the good guy. I'm saving this world from an alien, because I think he had voiced Lex as well. So I just say that was, you know, such an interesting aspect. And obviously, you know, the second half of it is, you know, other people as well, because you had, like, Troy Baker, John DiMaggio, Gina Gershon, people like voice these different, like, iconic characters. Everything. What I also thought was pretty dope was the fact of the matter is that Supervillain panel was also moderated by Tiffany Smith. I was like, oh, dude, that's so dope. But regardless, the fact of the matter is, obviously, like I said, I only saw some of the panels, and obviously these are just kind of my thoughts about kind of the information that was kind of presented and stuff like that. I'd love to get to know your thoughts, you know, about the panels I saw, but not just the ones I saw. I'd love to get to know your thoughts, because you might have watched other panels that maybe I hadn't watched, that, you know, that you know, want to talk about, you know, and share your thoughts about. You know, just talk about it all in the comments down below. I'd love to get to know your thoughts just about everything that was kind of presented. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.